Welcome to the latest virtual talk from Ormskirk District Family History Society. Today's topic is one that, surprisingly, we have never covered, and perhaps it's time we did. St Peter and St Paul's is in itself quite an iconic church. You may already know that it is one of only 3 churches in England which can boast the inclusion of both a tower and a spire in its design. The other churches, in case you're interested, are St Mary's at Purton and St Andrew's at Wanborough. Both of these, bizarrely enough, are just outside Swindon in Wiltshire, so that's in the southwest of England. The parish church of St Peter and Paul in Ormskirk is the only one in the northwest of England, and in fact the only one in the north with a tower and a spire. So it's quite unusual. So we've skimmed over some of the features of the building in previous videos, but since we've never really explored how the church came to be what it is today, before Christmas one of our committee members actually suggested that the significant renovation work that took place in the 1870s and 1880s would make an excellent topic for a virtual talk. And as I began to put this together, I soon realised that in order to fully appreciate the mid-Victorian changes, you also have to know what it was like before and how it had evolved over time. So by then, St Peter and St Paul's Church was reckoned to be about 700 years old. And there's a very famous legend about the church and why it has a tower as well as a spire, so perhaps we're as well to get that out of the way first. Many people say that Ormskirk was named after Orm, a Norseman or Viking, who built a church in the area that became modern Ormskirk. Myth had it that he consulted his sisters about how the church should be designed, and one of them argued in favour of a church with a tower and the other one argued in favour of a church with a spire, and they just couldn't come to a compromise about it, so to keep them both happy, Orm built a church with both of them, so this is why it has the tower and the spire. At the end of the Victorian period, the Liverpool Mercury offered a slightly different slant on that particular legend. Tradition says that 2 maiden ladies, daughters of Orm, the Saxon pirate, this is the first I've heard of him being a Saxon pirate, wanted to perpetuate their own memory, wanted to be remembered. The best way they agreed was to build a church. One wished for a spire, pointing men's souls towards heaven and teaching them to set their affections on things above, so to keep our minds on a more spiritual direction, quite literally. The other preferred what is described as a massive tower, an emblem of the strength and stability of the church. They each, being ladies, had their own way, but they accommodated their difference by giving the church both, so this actually takes Orm out of the equation completely. Both of those are really good stories, but the very fact that by the 1890s the Liverpool Mercury is using the phrase "tradition says" indicates that by the late Victorian period most people were agreed that this was a myth. It does, however, make an excellent starting point to explore Ormskirk Church as it was in the 500 years or so before the English Civil War. From what we can make out, the oldest part of Ormskirk Parish Church that still survives today, from the original building, is the north wall, which is said to date from the 12th century and includes a 12th century window in the north wall of the chancel, which is an incredible 2 feet and 10.5 inches wide. And I will note that you can also find a list of known vicars that have been compiled using the ancient church documents. The south arches of the chancel date from around about 1280, and apparently these once led into a small chapel. The Derby Chapel, which is said to date from the 16th century, is now on this site, and from what we understand, the floor plan may have looked something like this, evolving as time went on, as the spire was added in the early 15th century and various other parts were extended, generally starting to create a more practical building for the use of the community. There's also a hint from the 14th century that some other later priests came from other parts of England. They were not all clergy who were local to what is now Lancashire. If we now have a look at the Gazette Chapel, that's estimated to date from around the 15th century, so the 1400s. The windows in the Gazette Chapel that we see today are not the original ones. They were actually adapted in the second half of the 16th century, and we also know that from a document held at the Lancashire Archives that there is definite evidence that that chapel must have existed in the final years of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, which does match up with the concept that it dates from the 15th century. On the 21st of May 1591, after the death of James Aspinwall, Edward Gazbrick granted the dead man's widow, Catherine, and also his son, a licence which allowed James to be buried in Edward Gazbrick's family chapel in Ormskirk Parish Church. So this seems to be a reference to the Gazbrick Chapel. Clearly it was in existence and being used as a burial place by the last years of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. So in the mid-16th century, we see a significant amount of change. That is the point in time when the English Reformation happens. Up until this sort of time, it was usually a canon or another religious man from the community at Burscough Priory nearby who was appointed to be a parish priest or vicar of Ormskirk Church. Up until this point, everybody was Catholic. So it stands to reason that Ormskirk Parish Church, although Church of England today, would have also been a Catholic place of worship because there was no other option. Until the Reformation happened. Burscough Priory was sacked. They brought the bells from the priory, considering them to be valuable and useful, to Ormskirk, which I imagine, and you can sort of infer, must have had to change its approach from Catholic services to Protestant services in a fairly short space of time. And they get these bells to Ormskirk, and they're planning to put them in the spire. And then somebody had the bright idea to check whether they'd fit, and they found that they wouldn't fit. In order to accommodate these, the Great Western Tower was built approximately between 1540 and 1550. It's very hard to be exact about this. but the whole purpose of the tower being built was simply to accommodate those bells. It's actually a huge tower, 38 feet square, so that's quite a size. The walls are said to be 6 feet 6 inches thick, so not only is it huge, it's the size of a very large room, but it's also got these enormously thick walls, and so by this point we can guess that the floor plan of the church must have looked something like this. We also know that a chest for the church wardens was acquired in about 1557. This ties in a little bit because part of Henry VIII's changes in the post-Reformation period was the introduction of parish registers. Before the sort of 1540s, it was not compulsory, or certainly didn't seem to be common practice, to keep parish registers until Henry VIII, or probably more specifically his senior advisor Thomas Cromwell, brought in laws to change the situation, and everybody had to start keeping parish registers. And this is probably why you tend to find that there are few, if any, baptism, marriages and burial records for churches before this date. This chest for the church wardens is acquired in about 1557 in the reign of Mary I, and it was used to hold important parish documents. And an information card in the church today says that the chest had 3 locks, because the vicar and each of the 2 church wardens held a key, which meant that it could only be opened if all 3 key holders were present. So it is an early form of security. It's a bit like only allowing letters to be opened if 2 people are present to witness it, basically preventing people from stealing anything in the chest. And here we see a picture of what it looks like today. The north and west sides of the Derby Chapel were enclosed by a wooden screen in the 17th century. After restoration in the 19th century, 3 effigies were installed, which are said to represent Thomas, the 1st Earl of Derby, and his 2 wives. One of his wives was the former Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was mother to King Henry VII. So there have been some big structural changes in the church even before the 1600s. In the next 250 years, the interior of the church would see further developments still. Not everybody was going to like them. So here we are now, roughly 250-270 years or so before the major Victorian renovations. So how had the church interior changed in this period? The seating arrangements were overhauled so that all of the pews looked the same, and most families who attended the church no longer kept a particular seat. Unfortunately, the changes were not to everybody's taste, for the essential reason that the new seating was not considered especially comfortable. Some of the congregation actually went to the trouble of installing wainscots or wooden panelling under the benches and between the seat and back rail of each seat at their own expense, because being unheated, the church was drafty, it could be very cold, it's not a small building anyway, so we can infer that the new pews were considered by everybody to be functional rather than cosy. However, some wealthier local families did keep their right to a family pew. These included the Hurlstons and also the Laithwaites. Now by this point in time, the Laithwaite family home on the corner of Orton Street and Moore Street had been bought by John Entwistle, a lawyer. And a great commotion occurred one day in church. Jane Laithwaite, a widow, storms into church and discovers the Entwistle family and their apprentices sitting in what she considers to be her family seat. So how did she react? Violently. She did pull and thrust at one of the apprentices and would have pushed him out. The congregation was disturbed and many people stood up and stared at them. Jane then took the inventive approach of taking a thing out of her pocket, like a bodkin. So it's a kind of a large blunt needle, one of those things that you use for making holes in leather, threading ribbon, cord, other thicker materials through fabric, and she thrust the bodkin at the deponent. It doesn't say whether she stabbed him or not. So the following Sunday, John Entwistle ordered his apprentices that they were going to sit in the pew as normal. And Jane Laithwaite came back again, and she said that before he should sit there, she would have his life, and she would bring chamber pots and throw them in deponent's face, saying that his said master and all his family were outcomers and lousy beggars, all of them. You can infer from this that Jane was really quite upset about people taking her family seat. In the early years of the reign of George III, we find that there is an extension made to the Western Gallery, and as part of this there was a handsome and convenient pew installed for the use of women to return thanks after childbearing, and this was installed at a cost of £4, not particularly cheap. The Thanksgiving service after childbirth was quite an accepted part of life and church life at this point in time. It was a formal religious service to welcome new mothers back to church after they'd given birth. Biblical teaching suggested that a newly delivered mother was somehow unclean, and so there's an element of purification about this service. Maybe that is why there's a particular pew for the new mum to sit on. And from a more individual perspective, it also, of course, allows the new mother to give thanks for surviving her child's birth, because it obviously was not given then that you would survive childbirth. Many women probably knew somebody who had died in childbirth, whether it was a friend, neighbour, relative, their own mother even. They would have been really conscious of the hazards associated with what is simply the natural process of furthering the human race. Find Mr. Lightoller is paid £7, 13 shillings and 9 to draw up plans for rebuilding the north side of the church. I cannot find out any evidence about who this Mr. Lightoller was. I would love, however, to know if he was any relation to the Charles Lightoller who was a member of the crew of the Titanic. He came from Chorley or thereabouts. I can't find out who this Mr. Lightoller was. If you know the answer to that, please tell me. I'd love to know the answer. Now this year was rather a dramatic one, because this was the year when I think a storm, it must have been a storm, caused the top 15 feet of the spire to blow down. That must have been horrendous weather. And 3 years later we find that the spire is replaced at the cost of £34, which is a colossal sum of money. Moving now into the last years of the Regency period, by this point in time the design of the pillars in the church was anything but uniform. They were really quite varied. Some were octagonal, some were circular, some were carved with foliage and painted green with gilded capital letters. which sounds quite garish, I think, to modern sensibilities, and particularly if you have seen the existing pillars in the church, which are simply unpainted, unvarnished, undecorated stone, which looks far more uniform and what you'd expect to see in a church, really. But again, this is just the way architectural fashions change, I think. Now, one lovely thing about Victorian newspapers is that every now and again you will find somebody has written a report or an account of some kind of local tour that they might have taken in a particular area. In the Ashton Weekly Reporter and Stalybridge and Dukinfield Chronicle, so the sort of Cheshire, Greater Manchester, Ashton-under-Lyne area, from 1857, there is an account of a visit by an anonymous writer to Ormskirk Church, which gives us some interesting information. From the tower of Ormskirk Church, we obtained a pleasant and very extensive prospect over a fertile farming country, consisting largely of reclaimed peaty land, so this is mentioning the drainage of local land, because it's low-lying, it's at risk of flooding. In clear weather, the towns of Liverpool and Preston are indistinctly seen, but sufficiently so to mark their site. And talking more specifically about Ormskirk Church, in the bell chamber we found the tenor bell dated 1479 and 1576, and weighing 25 3/4 hundredweight. There is also a memorial of Mr. Ashton of Penketh, who died in 1707, being 6 feet and 7 inches tall. I think it may be John Ashton Esquire, who was buried in the chancel on the 22nd of July 1707. His burial record certainly gives us his name. It does, however, make no mention whatsoever about how tall he was. Just a couple of years after this, we begin to find that there are some mid-Victorian renovations taking place. Richard Bromley, the church warden, had organised the restoration of some new windows at Ormskirk Parish Church, and various people donated a window, as they described it. I think what that probably means is they contributed the costs of installing a new window. Mr. William Wellesby Esquire and Mrs. Webb had donated one window each. Miss Blundell of the cottage at Orton supported another, and one John Pemberton Haywood Esquire of Liverpool paid for a fourth. Mr. Haywood was quite an important man. Just a couple of years before, in 1855, he had been High Sheriff of Lancashire. Richard Bromley wrote to John Haywood about the restoration and asked him about donating a window as a memorial to his ancestor, the Reverend Nathaniel Haywood, who was interred in the church, and also as an historical remembrance of the events of 1662. Because Nathaniel Haywood had been the vicar of Ormskirk until 1662, when the Act of Uniformity passed the year before made it compulsory for clergymen to use the Book of Common Prayer for church services. All the clergymen had to make a declaration to that effect that they would use this particular book, and Nathaniel Haywood disagreed with this, and so because he wouldn't make this declaration, he was ejected from his position as vicar because he wouldn't conform to the law. The parish records for Ormskirk do, however, show that he was buried in the chancel at Ormskirk. John Pemberton Haywood was Nathaniel's great-great-great-grandson. And his response was to arrange to come over with his wife to meet Mr. Bromley on the 8th of March 1859, and the result was that John did indeed cover the cost of making and fitting a new east window, which is said to have depicted the Ascension of Christ. It was designed by Mr. Paley of Lancaster and actually made by Messrs. Forrest and Company of Liverpool. A couple of years later, the Earl of Derby gave 4 elegant stained glass windows for installation in the Bickerstaff Chapel. These were again designed by Mr. Paley, so Mr. Paley did really quite well out of this, didn't he? Perhaps it was a conscious choice so that the style matched the contribution made by John Pemberton Haywood. It certainly would make a lot of sense from an aesthetic point of view. Now we're going to see what the big project of the 1870s to 1890s did. This is the major work. Renovations were certainly underway by November 1877. Very soon, interesting discoveries were being made at Ormskirk Parish Church. Whilst excavating the chancel of the parish church near the vestry door and facing the Derby Chapel, it's very specific this, it tells you exactly where things were going on. Preparatory to concreting, the curiosity of the workmen was attracted by what appeared to be a doorway on the west side of the present door, below the ground floor of the vestry. A little higher than the doorway, on taking off the plaster, a beautiful Norman window arch was brought to light, a relic of the church as it existed in the 11th century, so this must be the earliest existing remains of the earliest church building. The right column had been barbarously chiselled away up the centre and the left nearly destroyed. The moulding of the window still remains and the masonry is happily perfect. There are also pieces of fresco painting. Another portion of ancient architecture has been found in the vestry facing the Bickerstaff Chapel, and above it another window appears which must have been mutilated and blocked up when the gallery over the Bickerstaff Chapel was erected. As with all new projects, people wanted to express opinions. One common thing that people did seem to do in the Victorian times when they didn't agree with something was to get out their pen and paper and write an angry letter to the newspapers. This is exactly what one James Bromley did. I'm not sure whether he's related to Richard Bromley, the church warden of 1859. He certainly could be. James Bromley was not at all impressed. It is horribly instructive to learn that to seek fastidious parishioners on some ancient level, 65,000 bodies have been rudely pickaxed, or as he more euphoniously puts it, cleaned out of the area of Ormskirk Church. Up until this point, of course, you've got all the family vaults, and also many other relatively ordinary people had simply been buried not in the churchyard, but actually in the body of Ormskirk Church itself, under the floor. By 1877, there were a great many people literally resting in Ormskirk Church. I imagine for public health reasons as much as any other reason, they decided that something ought to be done about this, and the answer was to reinter them in a more suitable place. They're actually in a particular area of Ormskirk Parish churchyard. You can still find it today. Perhaps today we would probably agree with that, but in the Victorian period it did not go down well at all. Indeed, Mr. Bromley goes on to state that the modus operandi of body raising, what a strange term, is too disgusting to detail, but it may not be generally known that besides several members of county families, the great and the good, the relics of an Earl of Derby who had the misfortune to be buried outside the family vault have been cleaned out too. So Mr. Bromley's not happy about that at all. A little over a year later, the Lancaster Gazette then tells us that the restoration work continues to be in progress. This is nearly 18 months later. It's a big project. The south gallery has now been removed. Some steps had also been taken to remove the north gallery. The whole of the upper part of the west gallery has also been removed. There was something else that the architects and the builders and the planners had to contend with. Many churches, particularly those with spires, are prone to being struck by lightning. We are told that the spire of Ormskirk Church was struck by lightning yesterday whilst a flower service was being held. Terrified by the noise, understandably I think, the congregation became panic-stricken and the excitement was intensified by cries of fire. Fortunately, no one was injured, and it is not stated that there actually was any serious fire damage. About 7 months later, there were storms all the way across the country, from Kirkwall in the Orkney Islands to all the way down to Cornwall in the southwest. The wind overturned corn stacks, swept roofs off many buildings, blew in one of the windows at Ormskirk Parish Church and damaged the roof. Considering they were in the middle of a restoration project, I can only imagine how annoying and frustrating that must have been to see potentially some brand new work being destroyed there. I hope it was not one of the windows that had been installed in the 1850s. So by September of 1883, the restoration of the Derby Chapel had just been completed at the sole cost of the Earl and Countess of Derby, who have manifested their interest in the work by personal inspection. They had actually troubled themselves to come and see the work. The vault beneath the chapel is now closed, so there were going to be no more burials, we can infer, in the Derby family vault. Prior to the burial of the late Earl in 1869, it was the burial place of the Earls of Derby, so nobody was buried in there, I think, after 1883. And then it goes on to tell us once again about the effigies in the chapel. Some of these are actually discussed in a book that one of our members has produced about the heraldry and the associated history. We have got that available on our sales list. The St Helens paper then tells us there are many effigies in the chapel. Those next the chancel are those of Henry Earl of Derby, Lord of Man and the Isles, Lord High Steward of England, Lord Chamberlain of Chester, Knight of the Garter, he's an important man, and his wife Elizabeth, the daughter of Clifford, Earl of Cumberland. He was one of Queen Elizabeth's commissioners who witnessed the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, and bears upon his surcoat, counterchanged with the insignia of man, and quarterly, first and fourth Stanley, second Clifford, so it's an acknowledgement of his wife's family coat of arms, third Latham. So that piece of information is really interesting. By 1885, restoration work had been going on for several years now. The Liverpool Weekly Courier observes that it had cost the princely sum of £7,000. The late Canon Sheldon had been particularly involved with it, and various local families also committed themselves to covering the cost of particular sections. For instance, the Derby Chapel, as we've seen, was restored by the Earl of Derby, and also the Marquis de Castasia of Scarisbrick Hall defrayed the cost of the restoration of the Scarisbrick Chapel. It was estimated that the remaining work to be done, removing the organ gallery, building a vestry and finding a place for the organ on the south side of the chancel, rebuilding the arcades, re-roofing the whole building, also completing the reseating, which had yet to be done. How they were managing services, I would love to know. Was going to cost another £7,000, the same money again. So how are they going to raise this £7,000? They did what all Victorians seem to do when they wanted to fundraise. They held a bazaar. This bazaar was held on the 29th and 30th of September 1885 at the Working Men's Institute in Ormskirk. It was opened by the Right Honourable Colonel Stanley MP and was attended by a large and fashionable crowd, including Lady Constance Stanley, that's the Earl of Derby's daughter-in-law, the Earl of Latham, the Honourable Mrs. Booth Wilbraham, I think that should be Bootle Wilbraham, that's the Earl of Latham's mother, Mrs. Blundell of Halsall Rectory, so that's the vicar's wife, The Reverends J.E. Woodrow, T. Maclean and T.C. Cox, Lord Latham's private chaplain, the Countess of Latham and her daughters, and the ladies Wilbraham helped out on a stall, so even the aristocratic ladies of the neighbourhood were rolling their sleeves up, getting involved and helping out. Mrs. Woodrow, the vicar's wife, and various other ladies also assisted with other stalls. The event, running over 2 days, actually had not one, but two honourable guests asked to open the event. On Wednesday, the opening was conducted by the Countess of Latham, and on Thursday, Mr. A.B. Forward. Who's Mr. A.B. Forward? He was elected MP for Ormskirk a couple of weeks later, so I'm sure he's not going to say no to opening a bazaar. He wants people to vote for him. The following June, the Bishop of Liverpool was planning to reopen the ancient parish church of Ormskirk, another nod there to its ancient origins, after this extensive restoration. And the now completed work embraces the erection of a new organ and choir vestries, and the restoration is intended to correspond in style to the well-known Derby Chapel in Ormskirk Church, which again it mentions the fact that the Earls of Derby were interred there. 12 months ago, Miss Sheldon, daughter of the late vicar, laid the foundation stone of the work now brought to a close, which has cost about £1,500, making an aggregate of upwards of £9,000 spent on the restoration. The work itself had actually been supervised by a committee. This committee included Earl of Latham, and his lordship, it is said, has also been a large contributor to the funds that were used for the work. Ormskirk Church, which is dedicated to St. Peter and Paul, is supposed to have been built shortly after the conquest. I'm sure they must have realised that not the whole church had been built after the conquest. It was, as we've seen, a work in progress over many centuries. It evolved, it changed to meet the needs of its community. Messrs. Paley and Austin of Lancaster have been the architect, and the contractors, Messrs. G and R Rathbone of Northwich. They're actually using quite local people. Paley and Austin were quite well-known architect. The references to the Earl of Derby have not yet ended. Ormskirk Church is particularly interesting inasmuch as within its walls lie the remains of James the Beheaded, Earl of Derby, and his noble countess. He was, of course, the one who was beheaded at Bolton, I think. His noble countess is the famous Lady Charlotte, who defended her home, Latham Castle, for 3 months during the siege of 1644, I think. She just refused to surrender to the parliamentarians, and it is said that the siege basically came to an end because they ran out of food. Lady Charlotte was quite a tough lady. The restoration of the church was commenced by the Canon Hornby, afterwards rector of Bury, but little was done until about 10 or 12 years ago. At the time when that happened, the interior of the church was surrounded by unusually large, deep and wide galleries, erected probably 1750 to 1790. I may just state in passing that the date of the church is believed to be about the 11th century, erected after a presumed Little Saxon building, so there's a nod there to the Saxon origins, which may be where the mix-up comes in at the very beginning about how they believe that Orm was a Saxon man. Perhaps Orm was in fact a Norseman, and the earliest surviving church that followed his church was a Saxon one. That would make a lot more sense. The arcades have been taken away to make room for the galleries and to provide accommodation for private boxes. And then it goes on to say again, when the buried parishioners have been removed in the 1870s at the beginning of the work to be reinterred, several of the ancient arcade bases were laid bare, as well as the bases of an early stone altar and an altar tomb. So again, another reference to all the ancient artefacts and features that were discovered as they planned to do this work in the first place. And it actually referred back to Mr. Bromley's earlier objection, suggesting that although his point about preserving ancient features of the building was a valid point, ultimately one had to be practical and see that the building was a functioning parish church, and so it really should be adapted to better serve the community that existed. Keeping old relics is all very well, but if that gets to the point where it's compromising its ability to serve the parishioners, then that isn't a good thing. Quite a sensible point, I think we would agree. Lord Derby had contributed a further £500. The cost of this renovation had now been estimated at a colossal £17,000. They really needed to do something about offsetting those costs, so what did they do? You know the answer already. They held another bazaar. In the large room of Ormskirk Institute, there were stalls again: Lady Latham, Mrs. Brighouse, Mrs. James Blundell, Mrs. Anderton. The day and Sunday school, there was a flower stall and a stall put on by the residents of the vicarage. Again, you get the great and the good show up. The vicar, the Reverend Woodrow, Lord Latham, Mr. S. Brighouse, who's a big name in Ormskirk, Countess of Latham, Ladies Wilbraham, the Honourable Mrs. Bootle Wilbraham is there, the Honourable Miss Wilbraham, the Honourable A. Fitzclarence, I don't know who he is, but he's obviously important, Mrs. A.B. Forward, the wife of the local MP, Mrs. Blundell of Halsall, Mr. R. Tomlinson, Mr. C. Hill, Dr. Marsh, Mr. E.C. Stretch, and various other people. So everybody, sort of middle class, upper class, and into the aristocracy, everybody who can turn up has turned up. So we're now at the point in time, June 1891, where the church restoration is more or less complete. It's probably no surprise to anybody who has been keeping up with the local press that the church is ready to be opened. So it was on the 26th of June that it was reopened for worship, completely restored, as the Liverpool Mercury tells us. The series of special services was held. The first one involved a procession of over 40 clergymen who walked from the tower to the chancel and the Bickerstaff chapel, so the 40 clergymen parading through the church. The processional hymn, headed by Ezra's words, "We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and built the house that was builded these many years," was thought most appropriate. The Right Reverend Dr. Bardsley, the Bishop of Sodor and Man, preached from the book of Revelations. He noted that although the Bishop of Liverpool was head of the diocese, he had recently been ill and had not the strength to take part in such an interesting service. The choice of the Bishop of Sodor and Man was not entirely inappropriate. It allowed Dr. Bardsley to talk about the close links between the Isle of Man and Ormskirk. The island's charities, supported by the churches over there, included the Halsall charity, and 5 bishops who have served Ormskirk are said to have been buried in the precincts of the old cathedral at Peel. It isn't stated exactly who these were, but that is an interesting point that I only discovered in the course of researching this talk. The Reverend Bardsley then highlighted the donations and gifts that have been given during the renovation of the church, and he was particularly careful to talk about the porch, which had been built using contributions from the children of Ormskirk. It's not explicitly stated, but perhaps these could have been the children who attended the attached Sunday school. However, there is a plaque in the church porch which you can still see today, which tells us a little more and commemorates that contribution by the children. Perhaps we should have a look at it. Now, the porch church was meant to be the final part of the restoration. However, if you've ever done any major renovation work, any decorating, anything that's become a much bigger project than it was supposed to, you will know only too well that once you've finished, it's practically time to start again. And guess what happened in Ormskirk? 7 years after the big renovations are finished, Ormskirk Parish Church is proposed to be altered and enlarged by the extension of the chancel, in which a handsome reredos will be placed. The work, which is estimated to cost about £200, so decidedly modest after the 17,000 they've just paid out, is to be proceeded with when the parochial schools are completed and free from debt, so they're not taking on more work than they can afford to take on, which is a good precaution, I think. Now, how do you sum up nearly 1,000 years of history? Is it even possible? How do you sum up the history of a building that, as we have seen, has constantly been changed in just a few minutes? That's difficult. But what is apparent, simply based on the research, the materials that I've put together to create this talk, is that there were so many events and so many opinions that influenced the way that Ormskirk Parish Church was moulded into the iconic building that so many people recognise today. It's even that there are benches in the centre of Ormskirk which have got a tower on one end and a spire on the other. The tower and the spire are to be seen everywhere, and everybody seems to know that that is something that represents Ormskirk. Had that spire been wider, maybe the bells from Burscough Priory would have fitted in it, and so the tower might not have been needed. If the powers that be hadn't decided that the seating should look uniform in the 1630s, maybe the family pews would still be there today, and there wouldn't have been that incident involving Jane Laithwaite. And if the renovation project of the 1870s and 1880s hadn't happened, then maybe countless parishioners, either 7,000 or 65,000, depending on which source you prefer, would still be buried inside the church today. That's quite an interesting thing to think about. There is a huge amount of information to be found about Ormskirk Church. This hasn't even scratched the surface. There are all sorts of other things that could be discussed. As I mentioned right at the beginning, we have got another video more about the interior of the church and what that looks like, which I will link to. There's a graveyard tour walk that we did as one of our summer outside visits one year. I will also try and find a link to that somewhere. There seem to be a lot of people following us at the moment on social media, so I hope that for those of you who are just joining us now, who are trying to find out a little bit more about the history of Ormskirk Church from a social history point of view, as well as an architectural or general history point of view, I hope that this has been interesting, and I hope that maybe it gives you a few things that you could follow up in your own research. We will hopefully be doing further virtual talks. Whether the world gets back to normal or not, they have been quite popular. But in the meantime, thank you for listening to this one, and if you have got any comments, suggestions, questions, then please feel free to contact us directly or via Facebook, or even just leave a comment in the box. We'd love to know what you think. Thank you for listening.